Good evening. I will now call this meeting to order. Our first order of business tonight is to adopt the agenda for tonight's meeting. Commissioners, is there a motion to adopt the final agenda?
So moved.
Got a motion? Can I get a second?
Second.
Got a motion and a second. All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. Our next order of business is to adopt the minutes from our September 3rd, 2024 Planning Commission meeting. Commissioners, is there a motion to approve the minutes?
I'd like to move to approve the minutes.
Second.
Got a motion and a second. All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Thank you. The motion carries. We will now move on to our discussion items. Our first item tonight is item 3.1, a public hearing for an ordinance amendment, amending the fence, sign, commercial district, and commercial use sections of the zoning code. This item does include a public hearing. I will now turn it over to City Planner Brian McCain for a staff presentation. Then I will open the public hearing for those in the chambers this evening that wish to speak on the request.
Thank you, Chair and Commissioners. Yes, tonight we do have a public hearing for some ordinances that the Community Development Department has been working on over the last several months and that you have already had a chance to review once. So we are bringing it forward for a public hearing and hopefully moving towards adoption with the City Council. So as I mentioned, we are exploring a zoning code overhaul in the future, but some of those districts need immediate attention, and those are the sections that we're bringing forward for you this evening, including our commercial districts. Right now, we don't have any commercial districts because we repealed them last year because they needed some work, and we're starting to see some movement in our South Growth commercial area, as you all have seen as well, so we need to get some standards incorporated into the code. For our fences, we do have some standard provisions that we're proposing, such as maintenance to be safe, clean, and orderly for the fences and have them consisting of workmanlike quality with the single color and the framing inward on fences. As part of the ordinance, we're also addressing prohibited fences and applying a enforcement and appeals process. And then we're also adding a vision clearance triangle, so a sightline triangle to provide clearance at intersections. You may recall recently some fences have been a point of contention regarding interference with the sightline triangle, so we would like to get this incorporated as well for any future fence applications. And then we also have standards for specific fencing distance requirements related to sidewalks and trails, stormwater mains, sanitary sewer and water mains. That's just to protect our infrastructure and for the sidewalks and trails to protect our residents and have enough area for snow storage as well in the winters. As part of the ordinance, we're also looking at the height and permit requirements. So also pretty standard to other areas in the metro. We are proposing a front yard maximum height of 4 feet with a zoning permit, and then the side and rear yards, they can go up to 7 feet with a zoning permit, up to 8 feet with a building permit. So that 7 to 8 foot range building permits are required. A note from our city council when they reviewed these ordinances as well, they did request that surveys be required for all fence permits to hinder any sort of encroachments onto neighboring properties or city outlots. And then for commercial fences, up to 8 feet in height maximum to screen any outdoor storage with a building, and it must be compatible with the principal building. So it must appear similar to the building. And it's also required adjacent to residential uses for any type of commercial fence with a 15-foot setback from street and drive entrances, once again, to provide that vision clearance. Then moving on to the signs, also reviewed by you guys, the goals are to provide cleaner language and address all different types of signage, as well as providing definitions for those and overall regulations for each type of sign. We also have a standard to address non-content controlled regulations in compliance with state statutes, and then fair applications for residential and non-residential districts, so signage between a residential property and our central business district business signage. And then clean and organizing the appearance, reducing the clutter. I think our current ordinance has about 30 subsections in it, so trying to reduce that down to about 10 or so makes it a lot cleaner. And then having good regulations to mitigate any hazards. So bolting them to the buildings with footings, making sure that the signs that are in our city are safe to walk under. Moving on to commercial districts, a lot of this should not be new information. I provided this table last time. It was also provided in your report. These are the types of primary uses that we are looking in our central business district, as well as our I-1 light industrial district and our two new proposed commercial districts, our neighborhood community or our neighborhood district, which is a more typical what you would see on the corner of a residential development adjacent to, say, like a county road, your neighborhood shop that you would go to, or your neighborhood strip mall with very low intensity uses, and then your community businesses where you would see sort of a community hub, your larger uses such as a grocery store or a gas station, things like that. And then here, they're broken down in permitted, conditional, interim, and not permitted uses. So anything with an N would not be allowed. So we just have to address that specifically for some uses where they would or would not be allowed. Once again, all these were provided in your report. So if you have any questions on specific uses, feel free to bring that forward and we can discuss those this evening. And then looking at the accessory uses. So these are what would be allowed in conjunction with the primary use. So when you think gas station, the main use is a retail establishment, but if they were going to have gas pumps, for example, they need a conditional use permit in any of our districts. So think of these as, side uses for a property. And then looking at the bulk standards, once again, these are fairly unchanged from when you reviewed them last. I think the height difference was originally 45 feet. We've actually bumped that up to 50 feet now between our central business district, our community commercial, and our I-1 light industrial. Once again, for the neighborhood commercial, this should be similar to what would go next to a residential type of development, which does allow buildings up to 35 feet in height. So we thought 35 feet was another reasonable adjustment for that area. And then also providing setbacks for businesses from railroads, since we have a railroad in town, as well as setbacks from residential districts. This is a new section that you guys haven't seen yet, our design standards. So once again, fairly common to other cities in the metro in terms of design standards. So screening equipment or mechanical units so that they're out of sight. We want our buildings to look good. We don't want to be able to see the AC units or anything like that hanging out on the rooftops. And then also incorporating standards for the primary accent and roofing materials. So we're requiring at least 40% primary materials for a building with a maximum 30% of accent materials, and then separate requirements for pitched and roof slopes in terms of roofing materials. And then we've also added lighting requirements. Currently, we don't have any lighting requirements in our commercial code, so we want to make sure that we aren't impacting other properties with light pollution with any new developments coming in or any of our current developments to make sure that we are avoiding light pollution. And then our central business district does have stronger standards, I guess I would say, and those are unchanged. So those are just being moved over into this new ordinance from our current ordinance. So not changing our central business district standards at all. But the standards that I just listed would be applicable to the C1, C2, and I2 districts, or I1 districts. Also, as an accessory use, we would allow accessory structures for some businesses, so they have to look similar to the principal structure. They would only be allowed in the side or rear yard, except gas station canopies. Those are considered accessory structures, and obviously would be allowed in the front if we wanted our gas pumps closer to a road. The size is limited to 10% of the principal building with one structure for every 5 acres, and we would not allow any membrane tents or shipping containers to be considered as accessory structures. The cities that we come from, we see that sometimes with residential property owners or business owners claiming that those are accessory structures, and we just don't want that in our community. And then the open space requirements, the only two portions that are really being changed are the C1 and the C2. So just reincorporating those, you may recall that we took them out with the commercial district repeal last year, so we're putting them back in now at the same percentage as what they were allowed before. And then conditional use permits, you saw this 2 meetings ago, I believe, so we're looking to clearly define the intent, applicability, and duration of CUPs. As you may recall, our current ordinance allows a sunset date for CUPs, which is not compliant with state statute. If we wanted to apply a sunset date on an application, that should be done through an interim use permit and not a conditional use permit. And then formalizing the process as we normally do with a public hearing and an ordinance or resolution and recording that document with Carver County. And then creating a process in case anyone wants to amend their CUPs and addressing nonconformities within the code section. So not nonconformities with the property, nonconformities in this code section. And then also having a link to our shoreline district because our shoreline district also has specific conditional uses as well. So here's a summary of everything that we discussed tonight. I'll come back to this screen so that we can discuss any of these further. But tonight's request does include a public hearing, which was published in the Waconia Patriot. It was also posted on the city's website and in the Monitor in the lobby at City Hall. And we do not have to send out individual mailing notices since this is a zoning text amendment. This affects the entire city and our zoning code and not a specific property. So with that, I have some sample motions on you for the screen this evening, and I can go back to the slides if you have any specific questions about these changes.
Thank you, Brian. I will now open the public hearing. Is there anyone in the chambers this evening who wish to comment on this item? Seeing no one in the chambers this evening, could commissioners, may I have a motion to close the public hearing?
I'd like to make a motion to close the public hearing.
A motion, can I get a second?
Second.
A motion and a second. All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Thank you. The motion carries. The public hearing is closed. I will now open the floor for the Planning Commission to discuss. Commissioners, any questions or comments for staff?
I had one, I didn't catch it when I was reading it ahead of time, so sorry for not sending it. You said on the fences that surveys would be required. I guess I'm just curious, like, is that pretty standard, or is that, it just feels like an extra step, extra expense for our community members that maybe do want to put fences in? So just wanted to kind of clarify the thought process behind that one.
Yeah, Chair and Commissioners, so typically with a building permit is when we would require a survey. That's in our code, so any fences over 7 feet would have required one anyway. Zoning permits, it's a little less typical, but we do provide surveys when someone comes in to apply for a fence permit. We look through our records. We typically don't make them get a new survey because we most likely already have one in our files that we can provide them with. In the case that we don't, then any property owner looking to do a fence would need to go out and get a survey in this situation.
Awesome. Thanks for clarifying, Brian.
For what it's worth, I think it's a really good idea because it avoids neighborhood disputes between neighbors when fences are put in place and you find that it's 6 inches over the line. So I think it's a really good idea. Yeah. First of all, I think the revised ordinances are much improved from the iteration we saw about a month ago. I have a couple small questions. In the central business districts, commercial districts, I saw that you've regulated CBD oils, those sorts of products. where did we end up on cannabis flower dispensaries? We talked about that last time, but I didn't see it in the commercial district register.
Yes, Chair and Commissioners, since it's not quite a permitted use yet, we do have a moratorium on it at the moment. If we do want to consider cannabis flower at some point, we would have to do a zoning text amendment to include it. We're not quite there yet with this current draft, and we're not quite there with our zoning regulations yet. We're still working on a draft, so that will have to come back as a zoning text amendment at some point, but we're not proposing it as part of the overall ordinance this evening.
Fair enough, I just wanted to be sure it wasn't an oversight. Second question, on railroad setbacks, I see that the setback is the same for residential as it is for businesses. Wouldn't we want a bit more setback for residential?
Yes, that is something we could consider. Just keeping in mind for some of the recent developments that we've seen, we have the Victoria South residential development, for example. So they received their approvals, I believe, at about 80% or 80 feet from the center line of the railroad. That probably puts them around 60 feet. So if that's something that the Planning Commission would like to incorporate, that's something we can certainly explore further if you have a certain distance in mind that you would like to see a residential setback from the railroad. Is that the question?
Yeah, I certainly don't know what the right answer is, but having lived in a house one time with a railroad going through pretty much the backyard, it is something I guess you get used to at some point in time, but it's certainly a factor for property valuation, and it's a nuisance. So I would just flag that for consideration. Again, I don't pretend to know what the right answer is, but 30 feet seems awfully darn close.
Looking at this now, for a business setback for a railroad is 30 feet, and a residential setback, the only type of residential that we would allow in
Oh, I got
our
it.
commercial is like a mixed use
Like
type
a light
product.
industrial.
Yeah, so if we're proposing an apartment building, or someone comes forward and is proposing an apartment building, I guess I should say, it would have to be at least 100 feet from the railroad that kind of cuts through our South Growth area.
So help me understand, Brian, why do we have 30 feet for C1 neighborhood commercial and C2 commercial community commercial?
For business setback from a railroad?
I'm sorry, for residential district. Maybe it's just not a,
Oh, yeah, sure. So I guess trying to think about this, the way that we wrote it was that in our South Growth area, where a majority of our commercial is going to go, we have a railroad down there. On the opposite side of the railroad, and adjacent to the Victoria South development is where commercial is going to go. And that's a residential property, so we got to think about those residents as well as the businesses, setbacks to incorporate those to make sure we're placing the businesses a reasonable distance from residential buildings or railroads or other businesses.
maybe I'm not following entirely, but I don't know why would it not be NA with respect to pretty much all of these except for, I don't know, I mean, residential districts and railroads don't seem to go together. But maybe it's just,
So I can go through these one by one just
no,
to
no, no.
provide some.
If I'm the only one that's confused, don't bother.
Are you confused on what a C1, C2 neighborhood would be, or?
No, I'm just confused why there'd be a residential setback in a C1 or C2 area,
Let me give.
community commercial area.
It could be like if you had retail underneath an apartment,
I see, okay.
like if you had kind of like, if you had a lower level was
So it'd be a mixed-use area.
like a mixed use.
Let me give some context.
No, I understand that we have only one railroad going through the South Growth area.
Yeah.
Is there a chance that we would have a business that would make use of the railroad?
Well, that's where you get into your light industrial or,
That's 30 feet, right?
and
Yeah. So going through these bottom three, just to give you some examples. So residential setback from a railroad within our commercial districts. So looking mostly at our C2 here, for example, right? C2 would imaginably go in this red area. You can see there is a portion that is adjacent to the railroad. So we would, if an apartment building was going here, for example, which is allowed in our C2 district, we would want to make sure that apartment is a reasonable distance, which we assume to be about 100 feet from the edge of that railroad. And then a business setback from a railroad, looking at the red and the purple here, these are business districts in our future land use plan. It's a little more reasonable for a business to be closer to a railroad in case they have any sort of association with the railroad in terms of their operations, and also less impacts to a business than a resident when they're sleeping at night and a railroad goes through during a business that's closed during the night. So smaller setbacks for that. And then setback from a residential district. So looking at our yellow, our orange, our brown here, these are our residential districts. So really looking at this line here, what do we think is a reasonable distance for a business to be from this line? And for the types of operations that we're going to see here, like the gas station that came through a few weeks ago, we assume 30 feet is reasonable for that. And then for an industrial type of use in this purple area, 100 feet from these townhome and single-family lines.
And in the future, with going into Lake Town, there'll be more railroad property associated with that also.
Mm-hmm.
All right, I just have one continuity type of question, and this comes up from something that came up a few years back regarding fences around swimming pools. Do they have to be 4 feet around the entire property or affected area, or do they have to be 6 feet?
Regarding height,
Yes,
I believe it's 5 feet.
5 feet. So that would be my question on the 4-foot max on the front. Basically, I couldn't put a 5-foot fence in based on this new ordinance.
That's a situation where a variance could come into play. Say there is no other reasonable location for a pool, say the rear yard or the side yard doesn't work for some reason, but they want to have a pool, and it would be allowed in the front yard based on setbacks, but we require a 5-foot fence for pools, but the standard is 4 feet for a front yard. That's a situation where I think we could potentially reasonably apply a variance to give them that extra feet for the necessary height for a pool.
Is that, this, my education, is that a state ordinance on how that pools are managed, or is that us, city as well?
I believe that's just us. I've worked for other communities where the standard has been 4 feet. 5 feet is our standard, though.
Gotcha.
Would it make sense to make the standard for pools 4 feet or not?
I would think so, but I would want to run that past our building official as well, just to make sure he's comfortable and there's not something in building code that I'm just
I think,
missing.
so pools was my former life. I think 5 feet is pretty good for, like, the idea is to not create an attractive nuisance. And you have to put, if you're gonna put fences in, it has to be reasonable so that people can't get over. And so I would imagine whenever you guys decided 5, that's probably the logic you stuck to, is 5 is much harder to climb over than 4. Just throwing that out there.
Sure.
All right, I have one other thing that I would like to throw out there and maybe discuss. For central business district accessory use. This has come up in a few different discussions I've had around the city. Right now, drive-throughs are conditional use, and I would entertain making it a not permitted use, possibly. One of the reasons behind that is if you think of a lot of cities that maybe we want to compare ourselves to, Excelsior, Wayzata to some extent. If you think about their main central business districts, there aren't any drive-throughs. There are drive-throughs off the beaten path a little bit, but they are not in the main area. You think about places that do have drive-throughs kind of on the main drag, and you're running into Chanhassen and Waconia. And both great communities, but I hear it all the time from neighbors, business owners, that we don't want to be the next Waconia or Chanhassen. So just from a consideration point, is that something we would entertain as not permitting drive-throughs in the central business district, or is that overreaching our boundaries too much?
I think that's kind of overreaching to a point where you're saying a bank can't have a drive-through, or a coffee shop can't have a drive-through,
Correct.
or Dairy Queen can't have a drive-through.
That would be the problem that we have.
Yeah, the new development, that'll be, with the coffee shop, that'll be a drive-through.
Right, banks and, you know, I guess is my biggest thing, you know, if you're gonna,
Yeah, but isn't that where variances come in?
if you're saying it's not permitted.
Yeah. Is,
There's, just for clarification, Chair and Commissioners, there is no such thing as a use variance. So when we're saying it's not permitted here, if we were to change drive-throughs to an end for the central business district, we couldn't in the future have a proposal come forward and say, yeah, you can get a variance for that. You can't.
Okay, thank you.
I think it's a reasonable proposal that Christian is raising. I just wonder, are there any drive-throughs currently in the central business district? I can't think of any.
Dairy Queen.
Chair and Commissioners, I can think of at least two. So Old National Bank has
bank.
drive-through with ATM and teller windows, and then Dairy Queen, as you mentioned, and then the third one being a recent development that you've seen lately, the Hometown Bank and the Mocha Monkey that Commissioner Iverson referred to. So just consider that we have existing and proposed businesses that would likely use drive-throughs.
All right, I'm just saying there's a concern, at least from some of the community on it.
Related question, car washes, evidently, they are not permitted in any of our districts except as accessories. Is that right? We're saying we don't like car washes?
As a standalone primary use, correct. If we had a gas station with a car wash, that is a more reasonable use in our eyes. We just don't want to have, I'll use some neighboring communities as examples where they have lots of car washes as primary uses. So that's something we just want to try to avoid if possible.
I would certainly agree in the central business district, but in, the southern growth area, for example, or other areas that are way more, I wouldn't have a problem with that necessarily, but just a point of consideration.
And I would imagine that the new station would have a car wash in the southern area.
Correct.
Typically is.
Yeah, correct, as an accessory use. So they would have to get a conditional use permit as part of their request when they come back for preliminary plat. Same with the gas pumps.
It's back to your point about the drive-through. They also, the way this is written, would have to get a conditional use permit, right?
Yes, correct.
Any other questions, discussion? Not hearing any more. Could I get a motion?
I would like to make a motion to recommend the city council adopt the ordinance.
Second?
Got a motion and a second. All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. Thank you. Our second and final item this evening is item 3.2, a public hearing for a variance at 6920 Foxglove Circle. This item does include a public hearing. I will now turn it over to Associate Planner Travis Beersley for staff presentation, and then I will open the public hearing for those in the chamber this evening that wish to speak on this request.
Good evening, Chair and Commissioners. Tonight is a variance request for a septic system at 6920 Foxglove Circle. What this variance specifically is to amend Section 26-168 of our ordinance, which reflects upon the county's ordinance, which reflects on MPCA rules for soil separation depth. And so getting to that, there is a minimum required separation of periodically saturated soil from 3-foot separation to 18 is the specific on it. The city did receive comments, more or less inquiries to what the public notice meant and what was being specifically asked for. There were no comments received for or against the project. We also did publish it in the the Waconia Patriot, and we did the proper notice to the residents in the area. Just to give a background on what a septic tank is, or what a septic system is, on the left side, basically, your waste from inside the home goes into it, it separates, and then what happens, you pump out what's called effluent, and effluent is basically almost like a gray water in a way. And what happens when it gets to the drain field, it gets spread out so it can dry, and the soil will actually treat any of the contaminants that are still in the effluent, so it can safely go back into the groundwater and be reused in other systems. Tonight's request is specifically to use an aerobic treatment unit, which pumps air down into a septic system compared to a mound system. With that, or with a mound system going in, the property cannot fit it and have it properly built because of topography. So by doing an aerobic system, it allows for it to be an above grade system or at grade system without doing the mound. And the way it's treated and things like that are just slightly different. But when it goes out to the drain field, the rules are set where it needs to be at a 36-inch depth. And because of the topography of the site, the request is to go to 18 inches. When we do look at doing a variance, we want to look at the practical difficulties. On the right-hand side is the site for the home. The septic tank is going to go back here in the lower spot. So the reasonableness for this comes down to there's no municipal service available for this neighborhood. Running a pipe would be expensive, and I don't believe we could justify putting that cost onto the resident for it. The natural topography makes it so that using a traditional mound system or even using the type 4 system or the aerobatic system that's been shown wouldn't make a whole lot of sense because it would be too difficult to put it in and cause a major disruption to the property. When looking at a mound system and discussing this between the county environmental services as well as the contractor for the site, a typical mound system, you'd have to build a mound that would almost engulf most of the site. So there'd be significant disturbance to put that in. And then the last thing we look at is, does it have an effect on the essential character of the neighborhood? Well, the adjacent properties have septic systems, and the shortened depth is below the soil, so you wouldn't even notice the depth to it. If we went ahead and recommended approval to the city council, and the city council chose to approve the permit, the city would not be taking any further action on the variance. Our regulation for septic systems is saying that we allow the county to make up what those rules are. They also have the people in place to take care of it. We would just require that the variance is required, and the county environmental services will take care of reviewing the permit, making sure any conditions that need to be put onto the permit to mitigate any environmental concerns or any hazards or anything like that, they'll take care of that. They'll also take care of performing the inspections and any maintenance that needs to be done. With an aerobic system, there's annual inspections that need to be done and reports. And talking with the county, they're gonna make sure that that agreement's in place through their permitting process. So it's nothing that we would handle at the city level. So tonight, I did put a couple motions together. The main motion would be, the staff recommendation is to move forward with an approval of the variance, and I can stand for any questions or explanations. We also have the contractor that's doing the install in the audience tonight, and then hold a public hearing.
Thank you. Does the applicant wish to speak?
If you have any questions, I can try to answer them for you. I'm Bob Dillon, Minnesota Septic Services out of Hutchinson.
How many of these have you put, are in the Carver County or,
How many of these we've put in?
yeah, quite a few?
I guess around 30. We've been putting them in for almost 30 years,
Okay.
yeah. I got 6 of them on the planning stage right now. Bavaria Downs, if you're familiar with that big operation, we did that, both of their systems for them, which are aerobic, but using different products.
Okay.
This one's more devised for residential. We got one right across the street from Mr. Johnson, we put in, I don't know, 15, 20 years ago. We didn't need a variance back then. Same type of system we're looking at for his, so,
Okay.
yeah, we put them in, I don't know, 7, 8 counties. Unfortunately, Carver is more restrictive than most all the other counties. We don't need variances in any of the other counties, so, I keep telling them, if you keep having to have variances, then you need to change your ordinance. I used to work for Meeker County, so, but nobody listens to me because I'm not a citizen of Carver County.
All right, thank you.
Thanks.
Okay?
I just have a question for Travis. Is this a new build or is it what's being used now?
So, Commissioner, there's currently a single-family home that's on the property. And to do a replacement of the current system, you have to bring it to the modern standards when it's replaced. To do that is, I guess unreasonable is probably the best word that I can think of to use for it. So, and that's considered a type 3 or mound system. The system that's being proposed, it's an at-grade system that doesn't require the mounding, and it uses a different type of treatment system. So there's different soil depths as well as the character of the soil that's involved into it.
So the current system just old or broken.
It needs to be replaced. So with septic systems, the county does perform inspections. I believe it's every few years. Every septic system has to get inspected. If it fails, the county can order that system is replaced within a certain time period. Specifically for this instance, the system just needs to be replaced, and to replace it with the traditional mound system just isn't gonna fit on the property. You're talking a lot of changes to the property, which will have significant effect and be noticeable from the adjacent landowners.
If we were to put a mound in on the slope, the whole situation is the slope is severe. Where I'm proposing putting a system is 20%. A mound would be 58 to 68 feet wide, only about 50 feet long. And it would get us down into where there's a slight water flow. It's not moving water or anything, just there's water that comes off the bluff area. If we were to move it uphill, now we're in a 40% slope. Now the mound would be 100 feet wide, and it'd still be down in that area where water can transfer through. The water coming out of these systems sometimes will go down to 12 inches to periodically saturated soil, water table. We can do that with UV lighting, and the water coming out of that is basically drinkable water. I don't drink it, but I've had a lab say that's well water. I go, no, that's coming right out of our septic system. They argue with me. I go, sorry, I know what it is because I took the sample, so. And the product we're using has been around the company since 1968, so it's not really a new technology.
My only other question is, with this property and this happening now, are we gonna be facing 10 other residences in this general area that's gonna have this same issue?
Commissioner, there is the potential always in the future. Different properties have different unique characteristics. The topography of this property is significantly different from the adjacent, but there's a lot of unknowns to what the standards will be at that time and what regulations will be in place, because you have the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency involved, as well as the counties their septic permits. They're called SSTS permits. And I apologize, I used to know what that meant. Off the top of my head, I can't remember, but
Sub-sewage
treatment systems, there you go. So with that, it's hard to tell. As far as what the city's role is in all this, the variance is because we have a statement in our code that says that we will enforce the county standards, even though we don't have anything to do with it. So at an internal staff discussion, we're reviewing that and seeing if that's required or if there's something we can make a change to. At the end of the day, all we're doing is we're saying that with discussion with the county, their county attorney as well as our attorney has basically said, we need to go through the variance process. And we were looking forward to seeing a representative from the county tonight. However, she was unable to make it, but it's kind of a weird area for a city to be dealing with septic systems when we don't do the permits, we don't do the inspections, and our code regulation is one sentence.
So basically, we're adhering to what the county wants us to do, but we're gonna grant a variance most likely.
Correct, and we've had discussions with the county on it and the environmental services, making sure that we understand what's being asked and what the variance is for. And realistically specific, it's just for this 3 foot down to 18 inches for the separation of the periodically saturated soil, the treatment soil. So by doing that, you have less treatment on the back end. Therefore, when the county goes through the permitting process, they'll put conditions on it they see fit, because they are the experts, to if there's a pre-treatment that needs to be done or if there's a different configuration of the system. So basically, tonight, by recommending an approval and going forward with that, we're saying that we trust the county to handle things correctly, as they're the experts.
So the early read is that the system would be as effective as the conventional system from an environmental standpoint?
Way more.
More effective.
In my opinion, and I argue with the University of Minnesota, that I've helped write some of the code for the MPCA, is my opinion, the drain fields on these systems could last 80 to 100 years. Research done by the university is the average mound, in-ground, trench system, the average life is 22 to 25 years. Because our water is it's crystal clear. It just like rainfall goes right through, where a standard system builds up what's called a biomat, and which creates a system, or makes it fail, so,
Okay.
yep.
How deep is the groundwater well? How far down do you go?
For the system,
Oh, for their drinking water?
what was the depth on your well? Don't know, but as long as we're over 100 feet, it doesn't matter.
Chair Commission, as part of the process, wells are regulated by the Minnesota Department of Health. And then with the permit, that type of information is provided so that even if there is a change to the system from the MPCA regulations and the county ordinances, it still needs to be run in an effective, safe manner. And that's why we default a lot of that stuff over to the county, because they have experts, they have people that are licensed to do the inspections and understand treatment systems better than I think collectively we all will in our lifetime.
Their well is 40, 50 feet higher than where my system will be. And anything greater than 100 feet, I don't even have to put the well on my design. It's from the
I have a septic system on my farm, and I think the requirements, which has been probably, 20, 25 years ago, was 100-foot deep for well in that part of the state, so.
A deep well is anything over 50 feet of casing. Then we only need to be 50 feet from it with the tank or the drain field. A shallow well is anything less than 50 feet of casing or impermeable soil around it. Then the setback is 100 to the drain field, but still only 50 to the tanks. And that's set by the health department.
Thank you.
Yep.
Thank you. I will now open a public hearing. Is there anyone in the chambers this evening who wish to comment on this item? Seeing no one in the chambers and for no additional public input, commissioners, may I have a motion to close the public hearing?
Motion to close the public hearing.
A motion, can I get a second?
Second.
A motion and a second. All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Thank you. The motion carries and the public hearing is closed. Any more discussions from commissioners? Any questions? Hearing no more discussion, I will ask for a motion.
I would like to make a motion to recommend approval to the city council for the issuance of a variance of Victoria City Code Section 26-168 for 6920 Foxglove Circle for a reduction of the minimum separation of the periodically saturated soil to be no less than 18 inches.
Motion, can I get a second?
Second.
Motion and a second. All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? The motion carries. Thank you. That concludes our discussion items for this evening. Moving on to the miscellaneous section of our agenda. Staff, you have any miscellaneous items?
Chair and Commissioners, the only item that I have is that we are still planning on holding our next meeting on October 1st. We do have a sketch plat in our South Growth area to look at that meeting. That's all from staff.
All right, thank you, Brian. Commissioners, any miscellaneous items this evening? Hearing no more items this evening, can I ask for a motion to adjourn?
I move that we adjourn.
Motion, can I get a second?
Second?
All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Thank you. The motion carries. We are adjourned.